Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, and Happy New Year. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown and I round up some recent news in the busy world of US immigration policy, from the end of 2024 and the first weeks of 2025. We discuss recent disagreements within the Republican Party on H-1B visas, President-elect Trump's immigration position nominations, and where things currently stand on the concept of mass deportations. We also cover congressional updates, including potential action on immigration through the budget reconciliation process, Biden regulations that could be overturned via the Congressional Review Act, and the House of Representatives recently passing the Laken Riley Act. So stay tuned. It's 2025 and a new Congress, and immigration policy is featuring prominently in policy discussions in both Congress, the executive branch, and elsewhere. In fact, these discussions never really took a holiday. In late December, we saw some heated disagreements within the Republican Party on high-skilled immigration, and in particular, the merits and demerits of H-1B specialty occupation visas. We also saw several nominations made by President-elect Trump for immigration positions in his upcoming administration. Meanwhile, Congress has been discussing what they can do on border security and immigration through the budget reconciliation process, what regulations they may be able to overturn through the Congressional Review Act, and what other legislation they can pass soon, potentially with Democratic support. So, to take us through all this, we welcome podcast regular Theresa Cardinal Brown. Thanks for joining us, Theresa.
Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year, Jack.
Happy New Year. So let's start with the H-1B disagreements within the Republican Party. Theresa, can you first briefly take us through what H-1B visas are?
Sure. So, regular listeners of this program have heard us talk about H-1B visas for many, many years. The H-1B is a temporary visa, it's a work authorized visa that an employer can sponsor somebody for in a job that is considered a specialty occupation, and that is the term used in law. That term is also defined as a job that requires a body of specialized knowledge in a particular field, usually associated with a bachelor's degree. So, in shorthand, it's a job that requires a specific bachelor's degree. Sorry for you general liberal arts grads that may or may not qualify for a job that you have. It's very often used by the tech community. In fact, tech employers have been the primary sponsors of H-1Bs since the visa category was created and amended in 1990. It has an annual cap on new visas that can be issued. 65,000 new visas could be issued each year, plus another 20,000 for graduates with at least a master's degree from a U.S. university. Some employers are not subject to the cap. Nonprofit research organizations, institutions of higher ed, and affiliated organizations are not subject to the cap when they sponsor an H-1B visa holder. So, because this has been a very popular visa, particularly in the last decade and a half, many, many more applications are filed each year for those 85,000 visas than can be issued. And so, since the mid 2000s, USCIS has conducted a lottery every April where employers will file all of their petitions for jobs to start October 1 under the new allocation, and they pick randomly those employers that can go ahead and sponsor their workers out of all of the applications received. The number of applications received has gone up continually every year. Hundreds of thousands of applications are received every year for these 85,000 visas. So it is widely oversubscribed. But the visa itself, even though it's been mainly used by tech companies, also is used for any job that requires a particular bachelor's degree. Everything from medical careers such as doctors, to attorneys, to financial analysts, to researchers, to all kinds of jobs. So even though it has a reputation as being a tech visa, it's not exclusive to the technology industry, but those are the heaviest users of it.
Okay, great. So let's move on to the controversy. So we saw some heated disagreements on social media over in December, and maybe still ongoing. Can you take us through what happened?
Sure. So in December, President Trump announced that a gentleman named Sriram Krishnan would be his advisor for artificial intelligence in the White House. He's been naming a lot of these advisory positions, and we've noticed, particularly in this second administration, many people coming out of the technology world, including Elon Musk, who's been, and Vivek Ramaswamy, the two that have been named co-directors of the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, which is not an official government agency, but is an external advisory group that they are running to advise Trump and the incoming administration on ways to increase government efficiency. But almost immediately after this nomination was announced, some of Trump's more, I'd say, hard right followers, particularly those who have been critical on immigration, questioned this appointment because in the past, Mr. Krishnan has indicated support for eliminating the so-called per country cap on green cards, as well as increasing the number of H-1B visas. He comes out of the technology world, and so this is a common position within many in the technology industry, but it's at odds with many in the immigration restrictionist base of the Trump Republican Party. So she sort of called this out. And after she did so, though, Elon Musk came back and said, actually, we should be expanding H-1B visas. He indicated support that we should be inviting as many people as possible who have high skills to support technology advancements. Again, a very common position among many in the tech world. And then that resulted in what can only be described as a firestorm on the X platform over these comments between many people who have been on the more restrictionist side of the immigration debate, who are Trump supporters, and many of these, technology people who are now in Trump's orbit. The debate, the back and forth, if you will, was further amplified when Vivek Ramaswamy then weighed in with some comments that seemed to denigrate the work ethic, the study ethic of American workers, which again created some more divisions among these different wings of the Trump's base of support. This went back and forth. I think at the end, Elon Musk did acknowledge that there were some issues with the H-1B program and how it worked, and maybe should it be amended. It has died down somewhat, but I think what it showed very clearly is that the bigger the Trump support grows, we're seeing people that are coming into the Trump orbit that have somewhat differing views. This is not particularly new in Trump world. The Republican Party traditionally has had sort of a more restrictionist wing when it comes to immigration, and a more, pro-business friendly expansionist, immigrants are good for the economy wing. But these tensions sort of flared up in very public view over the December holidays.
So Donald Trump did weigh in himself. What did he say?
Well, he weighed in after this had gone on for several days, saying that he supports the H-1B program. And he said he's always been a supporter of the H-1B program, which is not entirely true, because when you go and look through his policies in the first Trump administration, he actually, when he was running in 2016 and in 2020, said the H-1B program was taking jobs away from American workers, sort of reflecting more of that restrictionist position in his base. Many of the policies that were implemented during his first administration were somewhat restrictive of H-1B. As a matter of fact, after COVID, he issued an executive order cutting off all new H-1B admissions in the name of protecting jobs for U.S. workers. Now, that was eventually overturned in courts. His administration also issued a set of regulations that would have restricted or tightened up very strongly the definition of what's considered a specialty occupation, would have created new restrictions on third-party placements of H-1B workers, and that's another area that we should probably dive into. Many H-1B visas are held by people who work for technology services companies. These are companies that are basically contractors to the government or to other companies to do their IT or other services work. And so these are employees of one company who often are working physically at another company on a contract. And this practice has been going on for decades. It really expanded significantly in the years leading up to 2000 because of the so called Y2K crisis, where leading up to the turn of the millennium, there was large concern across the world, frankly, that computer systems that had been encoded earlier in the 20th century did not account for the potential of the clock turning over to from 19 something to 20 something, and that this was going to cause a whole lot of problems with software all across the economies. And so there was a very big push to get people in, and H-1B grew substantially during this time, to recode the software that ran many, many critical systems in government and economy and everywhere else to prevent this Y2K apocalypse, as it was called, from happening. But that business model of IT outsourcing, which is now very, very common, not just throughout the United States, but throughout the world, created its own controversy as companies laid off their in-house IT people and hired these other companies, many of whom were employing foreign workers. So this is another area of controversy that was part of the back and forth in December. Trump's previous administration tried to limit that third party outsourcing and to increase the salary floor required to hire an H-1B worker. These were positions that were opposed by the business community, that were litigated, and eventually were overturned by the court, in part because the Trump administration had issued them as an interim final rule without notice and comment. So I think, even though Trump is now indicating his support for H-1B, his past efforts were more critical of the visa category. And so, one of the open questions that this has raised is, sort of how will those in the new Trump administration who have differing views on this, how will it be reconciled, and what might some of those policies going forward look like?
Yeah, so we're seeing this disagreement within the Republican Party. Let's turn to the Democrats. What do they think of H-1B visas? Is there also a diversity of opinion?
There is. It's also an issue that can divide some Democrats. So, for example, we have seen some Democrats, for example, Democrats who represent Silicon Valley in California, folks like Representative Zoe Lofgren, who have indicated support for increasing green cards for skilled workers and removing per country caps, have been supportive of H-1B visa. And then you have other Democrats who come from a more pro worker position, exemplified most recently by Bernie Sanders, who weighed in on this controversy on social media, saying Elon Musk was absolutely wrong. The H-1B visa is exploitative and it takes away jobs from US workers. And he doubled down on those positions in the last week or so. So there is this divide, I think, among Democrats as well. So there's sort of bipartisan support for expanding the category and recognizing how it can help with skilled workforce needs, as well as bipartisan concern over the way the category might be impacting US workers, undercutting wages. And so, the outcome here has basically been a back and forth for many, many years.
So we did see a recent policy change on the H-1B program. We saw the Department of Homeland Security announce a modernization rule in December to improve the program's integrity and efficiency. What did that rule do?
So the Biden administration finalized a rule in December that changes some of the interpretations of the requirements for the H-1B category. Interestingly, this proposed rule had been proposed earlier in 2024 by the Biden administration, and some of it reflected some of the things that were in the Trump interim final rule. Initially, it did also restrict this definition of specialty occupation. It had some wage criteria, but the Biden administration put it out for notice and comment. It wasn't immediately implemented. They finalized the rule in December and changed some of the things that, frankly, the business community, the tech community, some of the pro H-1B folks objected to in the proposed rule. So in the final rule, it clarifies that to be a specialty occupation, you don't necessarily have to have a narrowly defined degree, but your degree has to be directly related to the job duties that you will be undertaking. So there has to be a correlation between the degree and your job. And not just the degree. what is involved in getting the degree, because different universities may issue majors that say the same thing but have different underlying criteria. So even if your bachelor's degree title may indicate sort of one kind of area, you've taken courses under that that would equate to a different title that some other university uses. So it allows a little bit more leeway for employers to kind of interpret what actually qualifies as specialty occupation, and that is something that employers had hoped to see changed in the final rule. It also includes something called a deference to prior adjudication. So this is another thing that under the previous Trump administration, USCIS decided that when you filed an extension of an existing H-1B category, they could go back and look at your original H-1B visa and decide whether or not it should have been approved in the first place, rather than saying we won't re-examine previous decisions as long as the job and the employer haven't substantially changed. This rule codifies that unless there's extraordinary circumstance that indicate there was some kind of fraud in the earlier decision, that they're not likely to reopen a previous decision if the job and employer has changed. However, if you are looking to change employers, they can go back and look to, and you have to provide proof that you have maintained your status for each employment that you have had in the H-1B category since you started. This is a way of kind of looking at some of these third-party placements and whether or not different petitions have been approved or labor attestations filed that would have been necessary if you changed locations. A few other things that were included in this: it expanded and clarified who are exempt from the H-1B cap that I talked about, particularly institutions that are related to an institution of higher education. And it allowed USCIS for the first time explicitly to conduct site visits to go check and make sure that H-1B workers are working at the locations in the conditions that were indicated in their filings. So it's sort of a mixture of trying to clamp down on places where the system can be abused and allowing some more flexibility for employers and certainty that cases that had been approved previously would be approved.
So, is this a rule that Trump is likely to keep, or might Congress consider overturning it?
So it is a final rule now, and it's set to go into effect January 17th, 3 days before Trump is inaugurated. So it will be in effect when Trump is inaugurated as a final rule. As a matter of federal procedure under the Administrative Procedures Act, if the Trump administration wanted to change the rule, they should have to go through a full new notice and comment process to say, we want to withdraw this rule or we want to change the rule. Now, other things could happen. Trump could issue an emergency declaration or some kind of executive order that suspends the ruling. Whatever is happened is probably going to be litigated. I think we've now at this point, anybody in the immigration space just believes that anything is going to be litigated that any administration chooses to do. So, but the debate in December over this visa, Trump's positioning, makes it kind of unclear whether this would be an initial priority. As I said, there are different factions within the folks in his orbit that have different feelings about this. How they reconcile that and where they move forward on it remains to be seen. So I think that's kind of an open question as to whether or not he would want to revise or change this rule. As far as Congress, yeah, Congress has something that it can do. There's a law called the Congressional Review Act that allows Congress to basically disapprove regulations that are made in the last portion of a previous administration. Generally, the look back is around 4 to 6 months. So most people looking at it think that any regulation that the Biden administration has finalized after August 1st of 2024 could be subject to one of these Congressional Review Act resolutions of disapproval. The process in Congress is both House and Senate have to pass a disapproval resolution, and the president has to sign it. So Trump would have to approve this disapproval. But there are some consequences to a Congressional Review Act that are different than a or a Trump administration withdrawing the rule. If Congress passes a CRA resolution nullifying a rule and the president signs it, not this administration nor any future administration can put forward a substantially similar rule on the same issues. So it really blocks the government from regulating in this area in perpetuity. So that's a pretty heavy hand. So that may be one reason why, if the Trump administration wants to issue its own regulations, maybe slightly different, keep some of maybe what Biden did and undo other parts, they might not want Congress to do a resolution on this. And since Republicans control the majority in the House and the Senate, Trump may be able to say to them, no, wait a minute, please hold off on doing that on this particular regulation. Again, these are all options that are available. We don't know what is going to happen. There was no, I think, firm resolution to this issue in the public spat. We have to wait until Trump is inaugurated and see what his administration actually does.
Okay, so thinking about the H-1B program more generally, we've seen this social media debate, disagreements within both parties. There seems to be a lot of people who do think that the H-1B program should be reformed. What do you think the prospects are for this new Congress that we're in now doing anything to actually reform the program?
So it's worth noting that there have actually been bipartisan bills to reform the H-1B program introduced in at least the last 4 or 5 Congresses. Two major senators who have continually co-sponsored H-1B reform bills, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, former chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Dick Durbin, former chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, have issued a bipartisan H-1B reform bill every year. Again, trying to address perceived abuses in the program, would restrict third-party outsourcing, would require higher wages to be paid to H-1B workers. I think bill that has been opposed every time it's been introduced by those folks who like to see the program continue or expand under the terms it certainly is right now. So it hasn't really moved anywhere, even though it has bipartisan support. So I would not be surprised to see that bill or a similar bill be reintroduced in the House or the Senate. Whether or not it moves, I think it depends. The Republicans in Congress and President Trump have said very, very clear that their priorities right now are border enforcement and deportations, right? Trump ran on this idea of mass deportations. And so I think Congress is not likely to turn to any other immigration reforms unless or until they have passed what they think they need to pass to support the Trump administration on those two major issues. So, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, how what they're planning on to do on those things. So, we'll see if it's something that Congress decides to take up. But I think in the short term, we're more likely to see just bills introduced and then maybe some hearings. But I don't know that they'll actually seriously try to move anything on it. Again, it's unclear where the Trump administration itself is going to come down on these issues and whether it would support such reforms.
Okay, so let's move on from the H-1B program. We've also seen President elect Trump make several nominations recently for immigration positions in his upcoming administration. Can you take us through some of these nominations?
Sure. So the very first person that he appointed, and this is not a nomination because it's to a position that doesn't require Senate confirmation, is Tom Homan as his so-called border security czar, basically an assistant to the president for border and immigration in the White House. This is not a Senate confirmed position. Tom Homan served as acting director of ICE in the previous Trump administration. He has been a career immigration officer in the government and was the head of the Enforcement and Removal Operations Division of Immigration and Customs Enforcement before he became acting ICE director. He had tenure as a Border Patrol agent, so his entire career has been in immigration enforcement. When he was acting director of ICE, but was never nominated to be the formal ICE director, which would require Senate confirmation. And since Trump left office, he's been regular on a lot of TV shows and news reports, and basically very highly critical of Biden's handling of the border, of their efforts on enforcement. So he has come in and is basically the face and voice of Trump's mass deportation policies. He's been talking about how that might look and how it might be carried out. So he's already sort of active. So that was sort of the first immigration name that Trump put forward. Following that, he named South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem as his nominee for Secretary of Homeland Security. Governor Noem has been governor of South Dakota since 2018. Before that, she served as the at-large representative for South Dakota. They only have one representative in the House of Representatives in Congress for several years. She came out of the South Dakota legislature before that. Prior to this nomination, I don't think many people thought that she had a lot of experience related to Homeland Security. She served on the Defense and Armed Services committees in the House. But as governor of South Dakota, she has supported stricter border enforcement. She sent South Dakota National Guard troops to support Governor Abbott in Texas in his border enforcement efforts with Operation Lone Star. And when she has taken positions on immigration, it's been, very hawkish, I think very along the lines of the Trump administration. But I think, as I said, there are some folks, particularly Democrats, but maybe some in the Republican Party, who are also sort of looking at her experience as not being particularly relevant to a lot of the areas that Homeland Security covers, which are more than just immigration. I want to remind all of our listeners, Homeland Security covers a number of mission areas, for everything from Coast Guard and Secret Service to counterproliferation and counterterrorism missions and protection of federal properties. So there's a lot that they do, emergency management, that is not strictly immigration related. So we could see some of those questions come out in her hearings. And then the latest two names that the Trump transition folks have put forward, Trump has named Rodney Scott as his nominee for the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. Rodney Scott is the former chief of the U.S. Border Patrol, which is the office within Customs and Border Protection when Trump was president before. He was either fired or retired before being fired when Biden came into office as chief of the Border Patrol. He is also somebody who, like Homan, has been highly critical of the Biden administration and its handling of the border. Been a regular presence on various news and media channels. But he is a career Border Patrol agent. Prior to that, he has served in many positions along the U.S.-Mexico border and in other parts of CBP before becoming chief of the Border Patrol. So lots of experience inside that agency. And then lastly, he named Caleb Vitello as acting director of ICE. So it doesn't seem that this is a formal nomination. Caleb Vitello is a career civil servant. His most recent ICE position has been the head of the Office of Firearms and Tactical Programs at ICE, but he's had several other positions there. Acting director just means that when Trump takes office, he will take over the role of leading the ICE agency. But again, it's not clear that that is going to be a formal nomination. It's worth noting that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has not had a Senate confirmed director since the Obama administration. So this is an agency that is going on almost 8 years of not having, more than 8 years of not having a Senate confirmed leader, of having acting people leading that agency. So it's unclear whether this is somebody who might be nominated, whether Trump is looking at other candidates to actually be nominated for the ICE director, or whether he just intends to keep acting people in that position. President Trump has said in the past that he likes acting people in the roles. He feels like they have maybe more loyalty to him. He doesn't mind leaving positions open for long periods of time and having acting people in them. So I think it's a little unclear at this point whether or not he will be nominating Caleb Vitello or some other person to ICE, and we'll just kind of have to see. But one question that a lot of people are asking is, given that Tom Homan, formerly led ICE, and he's now sort of in charge of this mass deportation effort, whether he will be sort of the de facto head of ICE from the White House leading these operations. So again, that relationship, we have to see how that all plays out.
Okay, so let's say these individuals are successfully appointed. What do you think will happen? Do you think it will mark a change in approach to the Biden administration and maybe even the first Trump administration as well?
Well, certainly it'll be a market approach from the Biden administration. I think it's worth noting that when Biden came in, he sort of came in with this idea that anything Trump did, I'm going to do the opposite. He did more or less that on the border, although again, kept Title 42 in place for quite a long time. The indications from the incoming Trump camp are that they intend to overturn a lot of what Biden has done, particularly programs relating to things like CBP-1, which allowed immigrants to apply for an appointment to ask for asylum at the border and be paroled into the country. That's probably going to go away. We know that the incoming Trump administration wants to continue trying to build the border wall. They want to do more expedited removals of people and send people back into Mexico. And so they're having conversations with Mexico about that. I think we definitely will see a return to a much more hardline border policy and restrictions on who can apply for asylum. We know that they want to reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy, which would require people who do want asylum to wait in Mexico rather than being released into the United States. So these are, a lot of return to what we saw in the previous Trump administration. Just this week, there are indications from Stephen Miller, the incoming deputy director for domestic policy, that that one of the first executive orders that might be issued after Trump is inaugurated is one that would reinstate Title 42 on different medical grounds than COVID. That just as a general policy, there's a belief that medical situations at the border cannot be controlled without Title 42. So that might be sort of one of the initial policies that come into place. In terms of the agencies and how they are run, these are people that come from inside the agencies. They know them very, very well. They know many of the people that are already working there. They're not new and they're known quantities. That can be positive or negative depending on your point of view. There are some that believe that these agencies are due for some big shakeups and kind of need some folks from outside the agency to come and ensure accountability, and others who say that the only people who can really get things done are people who've been inside and understand how they work. But what we do know about these names, particularly Rodney Scott, Tom Homan, Kristi Noem, is they are going to be much less likely than some of the nominees that were in the Trump first administration to push against things that President Trump wants to do. They are more likely to align directly with him. That has been a hallmark of many of the Trump picks, is that he is looking for people who are going to be very loyal to him and are not going to try to argue against his policies or push back heavily on what he wants to do.
Okay, so let's move on to the concept of mass deportations, which was one of President elect Trump's flagship policies in his presidential campaign. So, what do we currently know and not know about mass deportations?
Well, one of the things we don't know is, what does mass mean? How many are we talking about, right? Current estimates are there around probably 12 million undocumented immigrants in the country. It might be higher because the actual statistical estimates have not been updated in a couple of years. And we know obviously there are a lot of people that have been admitted under the Biden administration in various, not quasi legal categories such as TPS or parole. But during the campaign, people were talking about, we're going to get rid of all of them. All 11 million are going to be less. And then during the campaign, Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance said, well, let's start with 1 million and see where we go from there. Just for comparison, during the height of the Trump administration, the most people that were deported from inside the United States was around 300,000. During the Obama years, they deported around 400,000. This Biden administration is actually this past year deported close to that number. So going from that to 1 million is more than doubling the highest number of deportations that we've seen so far. So logistically, it would be a very large effort to try to do that. Then we've seen kind of differing statements about who would be targeted. So Homan talks very seriously that they're going to start with people who have criminal convictions, people who have existing orders of deportation that have not been carried out. So maybe they've not shown up for their deportation dates, or for whatever reason they've been ordered deported, but they haven't been removed from the country, that those are the people that they would start with and concentrate on. But he's also made very clear that doesn't mean that anyone else who's undocumented in the country would not also be arrested in the course of trying to arrest and deport those people, which is very similar to statements that he made during the first Trump administration, where he very clearly said everyone should be afraid of being deported, that we're not going to hold back on deporting anyone. Now, during the Biden administration and Obama administration, they put in place policy guidance that basically told ICE officers, if it isn't somebody that you're actively pursuing and you encounter a random person who happens to be undocumented, you don't need to arrest them. Matter of fact, you can't arrest them. Those policies have been subject to litigation. The Biden era policies on those were enjoined. In general, there's a lot of discretion that local ICE agents and officers have when they do or do not arrest somebody. But what Homan is saying is they will lean into the position of arresting somebody rather than not. In terms of, others have said that, they may expand this significantly. They're already talking about how can we use military resources to increase detention. So not only would they arrest people, but they would want to detain them and try to remove them as quickly as possible. The logistics of this, really, we don't know. We don't know exactly whether Trump is going to issue new orders that would create new policies or an emergency declaration that would give additional authorities for deportation. We don't know to what extent the military or National Guard might be involved, or state and local law enforcement, which is another force multiplier that they've talked about. In short, other than the statement of mass deportation and these statements that I've already talked about, we don't know logistically yet how this operation will be carried out. And so we don't know how large it will be, where it might go initially, until we start seeing the executive orders that lay out the plan, or some of the operations, and then we can have a better idea of exactly what this is going to look like. But there's been a lot of speculation about it. But I would say that to date, we don't have a lot of detail, and we still don't have a lot of detail. And we may not know until after Trump is in office, in part because, and this is something that I think as a lifetime law enforcement officer, Tom Homan understands, is as a law enforcement official, you don't necessarily want to let people know all the details of how you're planning an operation to go after them, because then they can more easily avoid it. So there might be a lot that we just won't know until we see some of these operations take place.
Okay, great. Let's take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll hear more from Theresa on congressional updates. Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. Theresa, let's move to Congress and what they are discussing and doing on immigration policy. So, firstly, let's talk about budget reconciliation, which is on the lips of many congressional Republicans at the moment. Can you take us through what budget reconciliation is and why it is important?
Sure. So I am not a budget expert or a reconciliation expert. So I'll talk about how it has tried to be used for immigration in the past. But in general, the budget reconciliation process is a process that was created with the Budget Control Act in the 1970s. And it's a process that allows Congress to pass certain budget related legislation only with a bare majority of votes. Why is this important? Well, in the House, most things take a bare majority of votes. If you have more than 218, half of the total 435 members, you can win a vote. In the Senate, however, because they have different rules, unless you have every senator agreeing, you have to have 2/3 of them vote to even talk about a bill, or end talking about a bill, or an amendment, or passing a bill. So that 60 vote threshold, it's called the filibuster, is a barrier, so that if you don't have a majority more than 60, you need to get votes from the other side of the aisle. And if there's things that you as your party want to do that the other party is not going to agree to, this process is a mechanism you can use to not have to negotiate with the other side. Now, when it comes to immigration, there are restrictions on what kinds of things can be done through reconciliation. This is also part of the Budget Act. In general, the principal purpose of anything done via reconciliation has to do with the budget. It can be to increase revenues. It can be to cut spending. It can be to adjust spending. It can be to address the debt or the deficit. In general, things that are strictly about a policy, even if that policy change would have a budgetary effect, may not be put on a reconciliation bill. This is mainly a Senate rule named after the former Senator of West Virginia, Robert Byrd, called the Byrd Rule. And reconciliation bills that go through the Senate go through this process called a Byrd bath, because puns, which any senator can raise an objection to a provision in the bill or any amendment offered to the reconciliation bill on the grounds that is outside the scope that I talked about. It's not budgetary. The parliamentarian, who's an officer of Congress, not an elected person, a professional who understands parliamentary procedure, will advise whoever's presiding in the Senate based on the rules whether or not this provision violates the Byrd Rule. And then the Senate can decide if it wants to overrule that objection. But it requires 2/3 of a vote to overrule. So any one senator can raise an objection called a point of order. The parliamentarian will say whether the point of order is correct, that yes, this provision violates the Byrd Rule, and then the Senate gets to decide if it will ignore that and keep it in, but it needs 60 votes. So again, the limitations of what can go in and that 60 vote threshold in the Senate mean that certain things are going to be hard to get on. Democrats, when they controlled the House and the Senate under the first 2 years of the Biden administration, tried to use the budget reconciliation for legalization programs and other immigration changes. And the parliamentarian, in a sort of advance ruling before the bill was put on the Senate floor, repeatedly said that these don't qualify. Even though they were all deemed to have pretty significant budgetary effects, the parliamentarian said in her ruling that those effects, although significant, are secondary to the main beneficiary of these things would be the immigrants themselves. And so it's more of a policy change than a budget change. And so the Democrats weren't able to do that. Republicans are looking at that history. And I think we're already starting to see them say, yeah, we could probably do things like funding the deportation efforts or putting more money toward the border wall, hiring more agents, hiring more ICE officers, creating more detention beds. That's all funding, that's all money. But it would be difficult for them, for example, to change the process by which asylum is adjudicated at the border. That would be a policy change. And so it would be harder to do that. So I think, there's also some back and forth within the Republican circles and with the Trump people right now about exactly how they want to use the budget reconciliation process for other priorities, such as extending the 2017 tax cuts. So they, whether there's one bill or two bills, do they do border bill first, they do tax bill, they're still debating amongst themselves, even among the Republican Party. The other thing I would say is that we have to recognize that in the beginning weeks of this Congress, because of absences and openings and some of the people that were elected to the House of Representatives who have been appointed to take jobs in the Trump administration, the House majority of Republicans is one vote. So that is really strict. It means that the Speaker of the House, the Republicans, can only afford to lose one Republican vote on any bill to pass it. That means the entire Republican Party has to be completely unified on what they want to do. And then the Senate also, they have a slightly larger majority, I think 53 seats, but they also have a pretty tight reign. So just getting the entire party on side is going to be a big challenge. And these immigration conversations may or may not fall into that. But I think what we're seeing and hearing so far from Republican leadership in the Senate, John Thune takes over as Republican majority leader in the Senate from Mitch McConnell, and Speaker Johnson in the House, is that while they may look to do some immigration stuff, it would probably be those things that are about funding and not necessarily significant policy changes. But we haven't seen anything yet, so could change.
So let's say they do focus on these funding changes. Do you think there are good prospects for them getting this through the budget reconciliation process?
I think, yes, the funding for the border stuff seems to have very, very almost unanimous Republican support. I think it's other parts of the potential reconciliation package that are creating divisions within the Republicans in the House and the Senate, particularly understanding whether any money spent has to be paid for through other revenue raisers or spending cuts, what the baseline for understanding the budget is going to be. This relates to the tax cuts. Again, procedurally, do they do one bill or two bills under reconciliation? And how many things can they reasonably get done in the time period they have? I think those are more things they're still working through and are creating more, I won't say divisions necessarily, but there are different people have different opinions about how to go about those than the border monies. I think border and immigration enforcement monies are not the controversial part of this. I think so other things could bring the reconciliation package down, but I don't think it's going to be the immigration provisions that do.
Okay, so let's move on to the Congressional Review Act, which we did touch on briefly earlier. Can you just quickly remind us what that is and why it's important?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, the Congressional Review Act is a law that allows Congress to basically undo regulations that are passed in the last months of a previous presidential administration. And, when President Biden took office and Democrats had full control, they used the CRA on several of the Trump era regulations that had not been restricted by courts. The incoming first Trump administration also managed to undo some Obama era regulations. So it's kind of typical when the presidency changes parties that and they come in with a sweep of all three branches, House, Senate, and the White House, that they try to use the Congressional Review Act on those regulations that they deem to be sort of extreme. And I think when it comes to some of the immigration stuff, there may be some things the Biden administration did that they will want to undo. But as I also mentioned, because the Congressional Review Act is kind of a blunt instrument, it really prevents future governments from regulating in that policy area. The incoming administration may want to go through their potential list and say, we'd rather undo that via the regulatory process rather than having Congress do it. And we haven't heard yet from the Trump administration what their positioning on any of those might be. We're only now starting to hear from Congress what kinds of regulations they may look to overturn. And I haven't yet, at least publicly, seen or heard that there are significant immigration regulations in the list of things that they may want to do. Typically, regulations around environmental policies, some of the Food and Drug Administration regulations, certainly abortion rules are subject to the chopping block because they tend to be things that divide Democrats and Republicans pretty substantially. So I think those might be higher on the list. But I can't say that some of the regulations that the Biden administration finalized wouldn't be subject to that. We talked about the H-1B regulation. Again, that may be one that the incoming Trump administration wants to look at more closely before they decide, yes, Congress, go ahead and undo it. Other regulations that the Biden administration has finalized, they finalized a regulation about processing of the asylum cases at the border. So after Title 42 was withdrawn, they finalized a regulation that allowed for asylum officers to adjudicate cases at the border without necessarily referring them to immigration court. They also finalized a rule that stopped accepting asylum applications when arrivals exceeded a certain rate, and that limited who could qualify for asylum if they arrived between ports of entry. So some of those are things that the Trump administration probably would approve of, others not so much. So again, not clear whether those are regulations that the Trump administration would want Congress to engage in, because if they wanted to issue their own regulations in that area, they wouldn't want that congressional veto out there. But they may want to make changes or tweaks to them. And I will say that those regulations are also in litigation right now. So one of the questions is to what extent or whether the Trump administration would continue to defend those regulations in court the same way the Biden administration did. This is another factor that we have to consider in this era of immigration regulation and litigation, is that very frequently litigation takes so long to finalize that administrations leave outstanding court cases to their successors, sometimes of a different party. And when the government decides we're no longer going to defend this regulation from the litigation, what happens to it? Sometimes there are other parties that come in and ask the court for permission to defend the regulation if the government decides it's no longer going to. And sometimes the courts will allow that. In the past, sometimes we've seen even Congress try to come in, or governors to step in to continue the litigation. But this is, again, something that Trump and his incoming Justice Department people, the White House lawyers, and others will want to look closely at and say, do we want to change how we're defending it, or do we want to not defend it? Do we want to try to settle the case and move on? This is the new complicated world of immigration.
So when a regulation is being litigated against, it's still in place in that time, isn't it?
It kind of depends. Sometimes the courts will issue a temporary stay. Sometimes they'll issue a permanent injunction. Each of those rulings themselves can be appealed even before the underlying case about whether or not the government had the authority to issue the regulation at all has been done. And that's one of the reasons why these court cases can go on for years and years, is because there's a lower court initial ruling, and it's appealed to a appeals court that issues a ruling that may or may not overturn, and that can be appealed up to the Supreme Court on that initial ruling, and then everything's remanded back to the initial first court to resolve based on these subsequent higher court rulings, and then you get to the merits of the case, and then that's appealed. So like the way cases go up and down the judicial structure, sometimes the rules can be enjoined, and then that injunction is overturned, and then they're back in place, and then a higher court comes in and overrules and reimposes the regulation ban. So regulations can go off and on, based on court rulings during the many years that the litigation is ongoing.
So, one regulation we did discuss on this podcast recently was the Keeping Families Together program. Is
Mhm.
that something that could be under the chopping block via the CRA?
Definitely, well, not necessarily CRA, because that was not issued as a regulation. It was a policy program that the Biden administration tried to implement under what it thought was existing policy and regulation authority. Technically, it's called parole in place. And what it says is that what they argue is that the authority of the president to grant parole, which is temporary entry to an immigrant who otherwise wouldn't qualify, doesn't necessarily only have to be for somebody arriving into the United States, because under legal technical definition, somebody who's undocumented in the United States is considered an applicant for admission in immigration law. And so they can offer them what they call parole in place, which is parole without leaving the country. What that does is it grants somebody work authorization, and it grants them a status from which, for example, in this case, if they're married to a US citizen and have a green card application pending, it would allow them to adjust status and get that green card without having to leave the country. Because if they left the country and had been undocumented for long enough, they'd have to stay out for 10 years. So Biden created this program earlier this year. It was very quickly enjoined in court. There were litigants who opposed the policy, who sued over it. So it never actually went in place. I think it was up for a week maybe before a lower court stopped it. That is a program we all believe that the Trump administration will end, along with the parole programs, for example, for Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the paroling of people coming into the border under CBP-1. He may also terminate various TPS designations from countries. All of those are things that the president could do, would not require regulation, are subject to the APA in so far as, and we saw this when Trump tried to end DACA in his first term. Programs that are created in that way, still the government, before they decide to reverse course and end, have to consider the equities of people who already have the status. They have to have a rationale for doing it that's not considered, quote unquote, arbitrary and capricious. Um, and courts can overturn even those kind of policies on one of those bases. And again, people who are trying to protect these programs may sue over Trump's attempts to end them as well.
Okay, well, let's finally move on to some other legislation that is being voted on in Congress at the moment. So, two immigration bills are being voted on this week: the Laken Riley Act and the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. So, firstly, what do these proposed pieces of legislation do?
So, the Laken Riley Act is a bill that was introduced in the last Congress after the murder of Laken Riley in Georgia by an undocumented immigrant who apparently had been arrested a few times for theft, and had not been apprehended by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The Laken Riley Act would say that any immigrant who has been arrested and charged with minor, I would say minor, theft is not necessarily minor, but a non what's not necessarily considered an aggravated felony or a more serious crime under immigration law still would be subject to mandatory immigration detention. So right now, somebody who's charged with theft, depending, may not be detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But people who are charged with or convicted of other serious crimes are required under law to be detained. It's called mandatory detention. So expand mandatory detention to some other sorts of crimes. There's another provision, though, that I think is raising larger concerns among many in the immigrant advocacy community. It's a provision that would allow any state attorney general to sue the federal government and require them to detain and or deport an individual or group of individuals who are undocumented and or subject to deportation. So it would basically provide a sort of private right of action for states to demand specific immigration enforcement of the federal government. This provision also could require the federal government to impose visa sanctions on countries that won't take back their citizens. This is an authority that the government has under existing immigration law, but because of different foreign policy concerns related to different countries, they may or may not impose it in part or in full. It's rarely been imposed broadly. Theoretically, you could deny a visa to any national of the country for any purpose to come to the United States, green card holders and temporary visas. It's never been used in that way. Usually, if it's used against government officials, maybe sort of some high profile people to try to pressure a government into taking back deportees. Again, creating this ability of states to demand a specific action of the federal government. That's raised some concerns, not just among immigration advocates, but among constitutional scholars about what it could mean for the federal government. So that's one of the concerns that have been raised about the Laken Riley Act. The Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act is a different kind of bill that would require mandatory detention and deportation of immigrants who have been accused of crimes against women, either in the United States or elsewhere, particularly in domestic violence cases. So its language is similar to the Violence Against Women Act, which will allow victims of domestic violence to obtain immigration protections in the United States. That one also is being voted on. Both of these, I think the fact that they're introduced initially very early by Republicans in Congress, and these early votes are meant to try to see where and if Democrats are divided on these issues of immigration enforcement. So these were bills that were passed last year in the House. They were not voted on by the Democratic Senate. They did have a few Democratic supporters. The Laken Riley Act last time, I think, had 38 Democrats that voted in favor of it. But by and large, Democrats saw it as a messaging bill, an anti immigrant bill that they were not supportive of. However, the results of this election have had many Democrats sort of rethinking some of those knee jerk policies or knee jerk positions against some of these bills. And this time, when it was voted on in the House this week, it got over 40 Democrats on board. In the Senate, we have now heard from a few Democrats that, including Democrat John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who's willing to co-sponsor the bill in the Senate. Others have voted to move the bill forward. We don't know yet whether or not they'll vote for the final bill when it comes to the floor, but you are seeing a shifting in position among Democrats on some of these bills. And some of that, as I said, is response to the way the election turned out. And many constituencies that in the Democratic tent, if you will, are becoming more centrist or even right leaning when it comes to immigration. And you're seeing Democrats, particularly Democrats that are up for reelection, or have been in swing states or swing districts, are reconsidering some of that knee jerk opposition when it comes to certain immigration enforcement measures.
Yeah, so what do you think that implies for future immigration legislation in this Congress? Do you think we'll see more bipartisanship on these issues?
I think that it depends on the issue. And it depends on the extent to which the Republican majorities, as slim as they are, one, either need Democrats to support things to get them done, in which case Democrats will have more ability to dictate what's in the bills. But on other things, you may see some Democrats more willing to go along with Republicans who, without necessarily negotiating the substance of the bill, simply because either the politics of the issue in their district or their own positions have shifted. Whether or not it'll be, I don't think we'll see a majority of Democrats going on board with many of these bills, but it could be enough to give Republicans the ability to say that, yes, there is bipartisan support for some of these things. But I think it's going to be a little bit case by case basis. I think where you're going to see a lot of this is on enforcement bills, such as the bills we're seeing this week. And we should note that we're recording on January 9th, 2025. The bill has passed the House. There have been initial votes in the Senate, but it has not yet passed the Senate. So we have to see where that finally ends up. But my best guess is that it will depend somewhat on the content of the bills, and which particular members we're talking about.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground on this episode. I think we can end the discussion there. Thanks for taking us through all that, Theresa.
Thanks so much, Jack.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.